She wasn't on the guest list, and somehow, that made her the most noticeable person in the room. The chandelier light scattered across polished marble floors as Olivia Hayes stepped through the glass doors, the soft click of her heels barely audible beneath the low hum of curated laughter and clinking champagne flutes. No one greeted her, no one turned. It was as if the room had silently agreed she didn't exist. A ghost dressed in understated elegance, her navy dress simple, precise, chosen not to impress, but to belong without asking for permission. A server brushed past her without eye contact, offering a tray to the woman behind her instead. Olivia didn't react. She simply adjusted her grip on the small clutch in her hand and moved forward, slow, steady, like someone who had already measured the weight of every stair before arriving. Across the room, Daniel Brooks stood beneath a golden spotlight of attention, his tailored suit sharp, his smile practiced, one arm casually resting around a woman in a shimmering silver gown. He was telling a story, something that made the surrounding circle erupt in laughter, the kind of laughter that seeks approval more than humor. Olivia's eyes found him, not with longing, not even with anger, but with a quiet recognition, like reading a name in an old book she no longer owned. He glanced in her direction for half a second, just long enough to register her presence, and then he looked away, dismissing her with the same ease he once used to hold her hand. A waiter passed again, this time stopping near Daniel's group. Someone leaned in and whispered, "Did she really just walk in like that?" Another voice, softer but sharper, replied, "I heard she wasn't even invited." The words floated, light but deliberate, designed to land. Olivia heard them, of course she did. But her expression didn't change. She reached for a glass of water from an unattended tray, her fingers steady, no tremor, no hesitation. The ice shifted softly as she lifted it, a small, controlled sound in a room full of noise that pretended not to see her. Near the entrance, a young boy's voice echoed briefly from a memory she couldn't fully silence. "Mom, Will. They know who we are." She had smiled then, a quiet promise in her eyes. They don't have to, now. Standing alone in a sea of familiar strangers, Olivia took a slow sip, the coolness grounding her, anchoring her in the moment, not as the woman they ignored, but as the woman who chose not to correct them. Not yet. The music shifted, something softer, more deliberate, and still no one approached her. Not a greeting, not a question, not even curiosity. Invisibility had a rhythm, and Olivia moved within it effortlessly, her gaze drifting across the room, observing, noting, remembering every laugh, every glance, every deliberate omission. She wasn't waiting to be seen, she was waiting for something else entirely. Something the room didn't even realize it was about to witness. There was a time when Olivia Hayes did not walk into rooms like this unnoticed. There was a time when doors opened before she reached them and people remembered her name without needing to think. Back when Daniel Brooks used to introduce her with a hand at the small of her back and a smile that suggested pride, not distance. She could still recall the weight of those evenings, the soft glow of restaurant lights reflecting off polished silverware, the quiet certainty that she belonged exactly where she stood. But that version of her life had been carefully rewritten, piece by piece, until it no longer included her. She shifted her gaze now toward a long mirrored wall across the ballroom where reflections moved like fragments of a story she had already outgrown. For a brief moment she caught sight of herself standing there, alone, composed, untouched by the noise around her. And it reminded her of a different reflection years ago, standing in a small kitchen just after sunrise, her hair loosely tied back, holding a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee that had already gone cold, her son asleep against her shoulder, his small hand curled into the fabric of her sweater. The apartment had been quiet then, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that follows something that is never coming back. She remembered staring out of the narrow window as early morning light slipped between buildings, thinking not about what she had lost, but about what she would refuse to lose next. Dignity had not arrived in a single moment. It had been rebuilt in fragments, in long shifts that stretched past midnight, in early mornings that started before the sun fully rose. In the steady rhythm of doing what needed to be done without anyone watching, without applause, without validation, she learned how to carry herself again, not for anyone else, but because she would not allow the absence of respect to define her. Presence, a voice broke faintly through her thoughts. Somewhere behind her a group had shifted closer, their conversation lowering just enough to signal intent. "I remember when she used to be with Daniel," one woman said. Her tone coded in something almost sympathetic, but not quite. "She really let herself fall behind," another replied, a soft laugh following as if to soften the words without removing their edge. Olivia did not turn around. She did not acknowledge them. She simply placed the empty glass back onto a passing tray with the same calm precision she had used all night, her breathing steady, her posture unshaken. The past did not sting the way it used to, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been understood. Across the room, Daniel's voice rose again, drawing attention back to him as he prepared to say something that clearly mattered to the audience he had gathered. Olivia watched from a distance, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, she knew exactly who she had become after he was no longer part of her life. The difference was no longer painful, it was defining, and as the room leaned toward him, eager to listen, Olivia remained exactly where she was. Grounded, silent, and completely certain that the story they believed they were watching had not even begun to unfold. The room leaned into Daniel's voice as if it had been trained to do so, every laugh arriving half a second too early, every nod just a little too eager, and Olivia Hayes watched it all without moving, her hands resting lightly at her sides. Her shoulders relaxed in a way that did not ask for space yet quietly held it. Daniel lifted his glass slightly as he spoke, his tone confident, polished, the kind of confidence built on being seen and affirmed over and over again. "Some people just are not built to keep up," he said with a casual smile. The words drifting across the room like they had no target, but everyone knew exactly where they were meant to land. A few heads turned, subtle, almost polite, glances sliding toward Olivia before quickly retreating, as if acknowledging her too long would make them complicit in something uncomfortable. The woman beside Daniel leaned closer to him, her hand resting on his arm as she whispered something that made him chuckle softly, and in that moment, Olivia felt the full weight of what they had chosen to believe about her. Not as an accusation, but as a conclusion they had already agreed upon. She could have corrected them. She could have stepped forward, spoken his name in a way that forced recognition, but she did not, because dignity did not require interruption. It required control, and control was something she had rebuilt slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the entrance, just for a second, a quiet reflex more than a search. As if part of her was measuring time in a way no one else in the room understood, then she looked back, steady again, present, unshaken. A server passed by offering champagne, and this time Olivia accepted a glass, her fingers wrapping around the stem with quiet precision. She did not drink immediately. Instead, she held it there, letting the condensation gather against her skin, grounding herself in the present moment. Across the room, Daniel's attention flickered back toward her, this time lingering a fraction longer. His eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to reconcile the version of her he remembered with the one standing there now. But the moment passed quickly, replaced again by the comfort of his audience. He turned away, continuing his story, continuing his performance, unaware that the only person who truly knew how that story ended was the one he had already dismissed. The music shifted again, softer now, almost expectant, and a subtle movement near the entrance caused a ripple that had not yet reached the center of the room. A few staff members straightened, a quiet adjustment in posture that signaled something had changed. Though no announcement had been made, Olivia noticed it immediately, not because she was looking for attention, but because she had learned to read the small shifts others ignored. Her expression did not change, but something in her stance settled even deeper, like the final piece of a structure locking into place. She lifted the glass slightly, taking a small, measured sip, and as she lowered it again, Her eyes returned to Daniel one last time, not with regret, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that did not need to be spoken, because the night was no longer about being seen by him. It was about allowing the room to discover, on its own, exactly what it had chosen to overlook. The subtle shift near the entrance did not announce itself with sound, but Olivia Hayes felt it before she saw it, the way the air changes just before a storm arrives, not louder, not brighter, just different, more deliberate. A quiet alignment of attention that most people would miss if they were too busy being seen, but Olivia had spent years unnoticed, and in that silence she had learned to recognize the language of rooms. A pair of staff members near the door straightened almost in unison. One adjusting his tie, the other stepping half an inch to the side as if clearing an invisible path. It was the kind of movement that did not belong to coincidence. It belonged to presence. Olivia lowered her glass slightly, her fingers relaxed but certain. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe a little deeper, not out of relief, but out of readiness, because this moment was not unexpected, it was simply arriving exactly when it was meant to, across the ballroom. Daniel continued speaking, his voice rising just enough to hold attention, completely unaware that the center of gravity in the room had already begun to shift away from him. A few guests near the edges turned their heads subtly, their conversations fading mid-sentence, curiosity replacing performance. The ripple moved slowly at first, like a current beneath still water, and then it began to spread. Olivia did not turn immediately. She did not rush to follow the movement. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, allowing the moment to unfold without reaching for it. Because control meant never appearing to chase what was already coming toward you. Somewhere behind her, footsteps approached, steady, unhurried, not loud enough to demand attention, but precise enough that each step seemed to carry intention. The kind of presence that did not need introduction. Olivia closed her eyes for the briefest second, not to escape, but to center herself, and in that quiet instant another memory surfaced, not of loss, but of choice. Standing in front of her small apartment mirror months ago, adjusting the collar of a simple blouse before heading out for a meeting she almost did not attend, her reflection had looked uncertain then, not weak, but unfamiliar. Like someone she was still learning to trust, and yet she had walked out anyway, one step at a time, building something no one else could see yet, and now, standing here again, that same quiet determination settled into her shoulders, no longer uncertain, no longer searching. The footsteps stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel the presence without turning, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath without realizing why. Conversation slowed, laughter softened, and the music, though unchanged, felt distant, as if it no longer mattered. Olivia opened her eyes again, her expression calm, composed, untouched by the attention that was beginning to gather. She did not turn to face him, not yet, because this moment was not about recognition, it was about timing. And timing, she had learned, was everything. Across the room Daniel's voice faltered for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but real, his eyes flickering toward the shifting crowd, confusion brushing against his confidence, and in that small hesitation, the first crack appeared, not in his words, but in his certainty. Olivia finally allowed the corner of her lips to soften into the faintest hint of a smile, not for the room, not for Daniel, but for herself, because she knew something they did not. The night had already changed, and this time, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He did not speak immediately, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any introduction ever could. Olivia Hayes felt it behind her, steady and composed, a presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and still she did not turn. Not yet, because the moment had its own rhythm, and she had learned not to rush what was already unfolding perfectly. Around them the room continued to shift in quiet layers, conversations thinning, attention redirecting in subtle but undeniable ways. A few guests closer to the entrance straightened their posture, their expressions changing from casual amusement to something more alert, more careful, as if they were recalibrating their place in the room without being told to do so. Olivia's fingers rested lightly against the side of her glass, no longer gripping it, just holding it as a quiet anchor, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed. Everything about her stillness now carried intention rather than absence. Then, without stepping ahead or drawing focus, the man behind her spoke, his voice low, measured, unmistakably calm. "You came in exactly when you were supposed to." The words were simple, almost private, but they landed with a certainty that reached deeper than the noise around them. Olivia allowed herself the smallest pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the power of timing. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately, and faced him. Sebastian Cole stood there with the kind of quiet confidence that did not compete for attention, it redirected it. His suit was tailored but unassuming, his posture effortless, his expression composed. And yet there was something in the way the space around him seemed to settle that made it clear he did not belong to the same category as anyone else in the room. Olivia met his eyes, steady, familiar, not as if she was meeting him for the first time, but as if she had already walked a long distance beside him without anyone else noticing. He gave a slight nod, nothing exaggerated, nothing performative, just enough to acknowledge her presence in a way that required no audience, and in that moment, the distance between who she had been and who she had become felt fully closed. Across the room, Daniel's attention finally broke away from his carefully held spotlight, his gaze drawn toward the subtle shift he could no longer ignore, his expression tightening just slightly as he tried to identify the source of the change. His confidence still present but no longer as effortless, a quiet uncertainty threading beneath it. One of the event coordinators near the entrance moved quickly, almost instinctively, approaching Sebastian with a posture that spoke of recognition rather than obligation. "Good evening, sir," the man said with a slight incline of his head, his tone respectful, measured, the kind of tone reserved for someone whose presence carried weight beyond the event itself. Olivia did not react outwardly, but she noticed every detail, the way the staff members' shoulders aligned, the way his voice lowered just enough to signal importance without drawing attention. Sebastian acknowledged him with a brief glance, nothing more. No need for extended conversation, no need for validation, because his presence had already said everything necessary. And as the ripple continued to move outward, reaching deeper into the center of the room, Olivia stood beside him without stepping closer, without reaching for his arm, because she did not need to prove connection. It was already understood. Her gaze drifted once more toward Daniel, who was now watching openly, no longer pretending indifference, the room around him slowly losing its focus as attention shifted elsewhere, and for the first time that evening, the balance had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and Olivia remained exactly as she was, calm, grounded, and completely untouched by the realization that was just beginning to settle over everyone else. The recognition did not arrive all at once. It moved in layers, quiet at first, and then impossible to ignore. Olivia Hayes could feel it in the way conversations behind her no longer flowed, but paused, adjusted, recalculated, the kind of silence that spreads when people realize they may have misjudged something important. Sebastian Cole remained beside her, not stepping forward, not drawing attention, yet somehow becoming the axis around which the room slowly began to turn, his presence steady, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and no need to prove why. Olivia shifted her weight slightly, a subtle movement that brought her fully into alignment with him, not behind, not ahead, but beside, equal in stillness, equal in control. Across the room, Daniel Brooks lowered his glass, his earlier confidence now edged with something tighter, less certain, his gaze fixed in their direction as he tried to place a name, a connection, something that would restore his sense of control over the narrative he had been so comfortably leading. A man near him leaned in, whispering quickly, urgently, and whatever he said changed something in Daniel's expression, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for the shift to be Seen by those who knew how to look, the event coordinator returned, this time accompanied by another staff member, both of them approaching with careful precision. "Mr. Cole," the second man said, his voice low but carrying just enough to reach those closest. "We have prepared your table." There was no announcement, no grand introduction, just a simple acknowledgement delivered with unmistakable respect, and that was enough, because in rooms like this, respect was the loudest language. Olivia did not look at Sebastian when they spoke. She did not need confirmation. She had already understood who he was long before anyone else chose to recognize it. Instead, she allowed her gaze to move once more across the room, taking in the subtle changes. The way people who had ignored her earlier were now watching, not openly, not yet, but with a curiosity that bordered on caution. A woman who had laughed before now stood slightly straighter, her smile gone, her attention sharpened, as if she were trying to reassemble the version of Olivia she thought she knew into something that made sense again. But it did not, because that version no longer existed. Sebastian turned his head slightly toward Olivia, his voice quiet, meant only for her. "Are you ready?" he asked, not as a command, not as a suggestion, but as an invitation. Olivia let the question settle for a brief moment, not because she needed to think, but because she understood the weight of what came next. This was not about entering the spotlight, it was about allowing the truth to reveal itself without interference. She gave a small nod, controlled, certain, and as they began to move together, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. The room responded without being told. Conversations fell away, eyes followed, and the invisible line that had once kept her on the outside dissolved completely. Daniel watched them now without pretending otherwise. His expression caught between recognition and disbelief, as if he were witnessing something that did not fit into the version of reality he had constructed. And Olivia did not look away. She did not lower her gaze. She met his eyes for a brief, unshaken second, not to confront him, not to prove anything, but simply to let him see, clearly and without explanation, that the woman he thought he had left behind was no longer standing where he expected her to be. And as she turned her attention forward again, continuing beside Sebastian toward the place that had already been prepared for them, the room followed in silence, because the story they thought they understood was no longer theirs to control. By the time Olivia Hayes and Sebastian Cole reached the center of the room, the silence had already formed around them, not complete, not absolute, but deliberate enough to be felt. Like a conversation that had chosen to pause rather than continue incorrectly, the table prepared for them stood slightly elevated, not by design alone but by placement, positioned where visibility was inevitable without ever being forced. Sebastian gestured lightly toward the chair, not with grand formality but with quiet assurance, and Olivia took her seat without hesitation, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if she had always belonged exactly there. No introduction was made, no announcement requested, yet the shift was undeniable. Across the room, Daniel Brooks remained standing, his glass still in his hand though he had long stopped drinking from it. The conversation around him fractured into smaller, quieter exchanges, each one circling the same unspoken question: who exactly had just arrived, and why did it matter so much? The woman beside him followed his gaze, her earlier confidence softening into something more cautious, her smile no longer effortless but measured, as if she were recalculating her place in a room that no longer responded the way it had just minutes ago. One of the men near Daniel leaned closer again, speaking in a tone that carried urgency without volume, and this time Daniel did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on Olivia and Sebastian. The realization forming not as a sudden shock but as a slow, unavoidable conclusion. Back at the table, Sebastian spoke briefly with the staff, his tone calm, his words minimal, and every response he received was immediate, precise, the kind of efficiency reserved for someone whose expectations were never questioned. Olivia observed quietly, not as someone impressed, but as someone already familiar with the way influence moved without needing to be displayed. A server approached and placed a fresh glass of water before her without needing to ask. Another adjusted the setting with careful attention, and through it all, Olivia remained composed, her presence no longer overlooked, but not performing for attention either. She did not scan the room. She did not seek reactions, because she did not need confirmation. She had already stepped beyond the space where validation was required. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally set his glass down, the soft clink against the table barely audible yet carrying more weight than any of his earlier words. He took a step forward, then another, his posture still controlled but no longer entirely certain, the path between them not physically blocked yet somehow more difficult to cross than it should have been. People shifted slightly as he moved, not obstructing him but not facilitating him either, as if the room itself had subtly redefined its alignment. Olivia noticed his movement without turning her head, a peripheral awareness sharpened by years of learning when attention mattered and when it did not. Sebastian's gaze lifted briefly, acknowledging Daniel's approach without inviting it, a simple glance that held no hostility, no challenge, just clarity. And that clarity was enough to slow Daniel's steps for a fraction of a second, just enough for hesitation to become visible, and in that hesitation, the roles that had once been so clearly defined began to reverse, not through confrontation, not through words, but through presence alone. Olivia rested her hands lightly on the table, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and as the distance between past and present narrowed into a single moment, she did not prepare to speak, she did not brace for conflict. Because this was never about reclaiming anything that had been lost, it was about standing fully in what she had built without needing to explain it, and as Daniel drew closer, the room held its quiet, waiting not for a scene, but for the truth that no one could ignore anymore. Daniel Brooks stopped just short of the table, close enough now that distance could no longer protect him from what he was seeing, yet far enough that he had not fully committed to stepping into a space that no longer responded to him the way it once did. His eyes moved from Olivia Hayes to Sebastian Cole and back again, searching for something familiar, something he could still control, but nothing aligned with the narrative he had built in his mind. "Olivia," he said finally, her name leaving his mouth slower than expected, as if it had not been used in a long time and no longer fit as easily as it once did. Olivia lifted her gaze to meet his, calm, steady, without urgency. She did not stand, she did not shift forward. She remained seated, grounded in a position that did not require adjustment to accommodate his presence. "Daniel," she replied, her voice even, neither warm nor cold, simply precise, and that precision carried more distance than silence ever could. He gave a brief, uncertain smile, the kind that tries to bridge a gap without acknowledging how wide it has become. "I did not know you would be here," he said, and the words hung in the air, revealing more than they intended. Olivia tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet observation. "That is clear," she answered, her tone unchanged. No accusation, no emphasis, just truth delivered without decoration. Daniel's attention shifted quickly toward Sebastian, the question forming before he could stop it. "And you are," he began, but the sentence did not finish, because at that exact moment, the event coordinator stepped forward again, his timing precise, his posture aligned with a level of respect that did not require explanation. "Mr. Cole," he said, addressing Sebastian directly, "the board members have arrived and are waiting for your remarks before the presentation begins." The words were simple, but their implication moved through the room instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, but with unmistakable clarity. A few people nearby straightened further, others exchanged quick glances, and the quiet realization began to settle into place. Daniel's expression shifted, not into shock, but into recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent its impact. His eyes returned to Sebastian, this time not searching, but confirming, piecing together fragments he should have noticed sooner: the name, the presence, the way the room had changed without announcement. Sebastian met his gaze briefly, offering a polite nod, nothing more, no extended acknowledgement, no attempt to engage, because he did not need to define himself in that moment. The room had already done it for him. Olivia remained still, her hands resting lightly against the table, her posture unchanged. She did not look at Daniel again, not because she was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left to resolve in his direction. The truth had already revealed itself without her needing to say a word. Daniel exhaled slowly, a quiet release of something he could no longer hold together, his earlier confidence replaced not with embarrassment, but with a subtle understanding that the roles he had assumed were no longer his to claim. He gave a small nod, almost reflexive, as if acknowledging something he could not fully articulate, and then he stepped back, not dramatically, not abruptly, just enough to create distance again, the kind of distance that now belonged to him, not her. The room remained quiet for a moment longer, absorbing the shift, recalibrating, and then, slowly, conversation resumed, but it was different now, more measured, more aware, as if everyone present understood that something important had just been revealed, even if no one had announced it, and, through it all, Olivia Hayes sat exactly where she was, composed, unshaken, no longer invisible, but never needing to demand attention again. The room never fully returned to what it had been before. Even as conversations slowly resumed and glasses were lifted again, there was a new awareness woven into every movement, a quiet recognition that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Olivia Hayes sat in that stillness without absorbing any of the attention that now circled her, because she was not there to receive it. She was there because she no longer needed to avoid it. Sebastian Cole rose when his name was called. Again, his presence acknowledged not with applause but with immediate compliance, the kind of response that came from people who understood hierarchy without needing it explained. He placed a brief, steady glance on Olivia before stepping away. Not as a departure, but as a continuation of something already understood between them. She watched him walk toward the front of the room where the board members waited, their posture shifting as he approached, their earlier ease replaced by a sharper attentiveness, and for a moment, the entire space seemed to align around him, not because he demanded it, but because it naturally followed. Olivia did not follow with her eyes for long. She turned instead toward the glass of water in front of her, lifting it slowly, the surface reflecting a softened version of the room around her, and in that reflection she caught something familiar, not from tonight, but from years ago, the quiet woman standing in a small apartment, holding her life together. With both hands unseen, unheard, but still standing, she did not feel the distance between that woman and who she was now. She felt the connection, the continuity, the quiet strength that had never left, just evolved. Across the room, Daniel Brooks remained where he had stepped back to, no longer at the center, no longer surrounded in the same way. He spoke again, but his voice did not carry like before. It did not command the room. It existed within it, equal to every other voice, and for the first time, he did not try to reclaim the attention he had lost. He simply stood within the new balance, aware of it, adjusting to it. Olivia set the glass back down, her fingers releasing it without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her presence settled. A few people glanced toward her again, more openly now, but she did not meet their eyes, not out of avoidance, but because she had nothing to prove to them. The validation they offered had arrived too late to matter. The music shifted once more, softer, more distant, and the evening began to move forward. But for Olivia, something had already concluded, not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. When Sebastian returned, he did not make a display of it. He simply resumed his place beside her, and without a word, without a signal, they both stood, their movement synchronized not by planning but by understanding, and as they walked toward the exit, no one stopped them. No one questioned them. The path opened naturally, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Olivia did not look back, not at Daniel, not at the room, because there was nothing behind her that required closure anymore. And as the doors opened and the night air met her, cool and steady, she stepped forward without hesitation, not as someone who had returned to prove a point, but as someone who had already moved beyond the need to be seen. She did not win him back. She did not reclaim the past. She simply walked into a future that no longer included the limits they had once placed on her, and that was the only victory that had ever mattered.